So now let's look at some conclusions and some of the implications of the Old Testament, Genesis and the book of Job. Now the Old Testament forms one of the oldest and most treasured collections of sacred books from the ancient world. It's centered on the Torah, and it's explained by the prophets and illustrated by the wisdom books. And there's an enormous body of scholarship focused on the Old Testament. There are three world religions that look to the Old Testament and revere it for its wisdom. Of course, Judaism itself, which sees it as the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh. Christianity calls it the Old Testament, and Islam just simply refers to it as the book. And all of these revere and look to the Old Testament for inspiration, though each one interprets it differently. Judaism sees it as the Old Testament really is the full extent of Scripture, whereas Christianity sees it as really the Old Testament and the New Testament together are full inspiration and revelation of God. Whereas Islam sees the Quran as being above and beyond the Old Testament, and the Old Testament is it is essentially a holy book, but not nearly as important as the Quran. For the Hebrews and ancient Israel, the Old Testament tells of their origins, it tells of their purpose and their history, and in some ways it validates Israel and it validates their purpose and validates some of their claims and so forth as a nation historically. Genesis explains the human condition, explains why we are so great, why human beings are so magnificent, but at the same time why we're so miserably fallen and why we struggle so much. It offers hope for redemption from a God who provides, always provides, a path of redemption, a path of restoration. And we see this all through Scripture. God, even with Adam and Eve, after they fall in the garden, God makes them skins to wear so that they can be presentable and so forth. We see this with Noah and all through the Scriptures. Of course, Christians will go on to see that Christ is the ultimate plan, a final plan of redemption and restoration. Christians see Christ as the Messiah who was prophesied in the Old Testament, especially, for example, in the Psalms and in Isaiah, to be hope for everyone, for the whole world. Job, we see, offers hope during inexplicable suffering. We can trust God to be merciful to each of us as He unfolds His plans that we don't understand, can't comprehend. And think about it, there are tens of billions of people throughout the history of the world, over 4 billion living at this very moment, who look to the Old Testament for guidance on the creation of the cosmos, the earth, the human race, and for wisdom. There's simply no book in ancient history, no book in contemporary history that rivals the Old Testament for its continual influence on people's worldviews, where there's a transcendent origin of everything that comes from a divine, omni-intelligent, omnipotent, and benevolent God who precedes all and depends on nothing for His existence.